This is the Livingston. And this is Livingston, one of our foster kittens and the inspiration for the name of this pouch. This pouch goes wherever you go. Use it for your glasses and extra toiletry items, or your tech gear, like extra batteries and charging cables, or even snacks, whatever you need it for. And you can make it yourself. I'm Taylor, welcome to Taylor Tailor. This channel is all about sewing your own bags and gear, from everyday carry pouches to totes and slings. Today we are making the Livingston, a slim zippered pouch with a little more personality than your standard box pouch. The angled side seams give it a slightly more refined shape, and the whole thing is cut from a single pattern piece, which makes it very approachable for beginners. There are no curves to sew. If you can sew a straight line, you've got what it takes. All you need is a regular sewing machine and a few basic tools. In this video, you'll learn how to install a zipper, how to finish seams with a binding, a technique that's really common in bag making and gear construction, plus the fundamentals of this classic slim pouch construction. I've got a pattern for the Livingston at taylortailor.com with full written instructions and diagrams to go along with this video. The link is in the description below. But even if you don't have the pattern yet, or you're not ready to sew today, stick around. You'll pick up techniques you can use on a lot of projects. I'll show you everything you need to know step by step. Let's get into it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to need as far as materials go for this project. You're going to want to have your pattern put together and cut out. And a real quick note on pattern scale here, you want to make sure that your printer has printed this at 100%. Sometimes printers like to scale up or scale down things when they print, and you can check that by putting a ruler right here. This little diamond square shape in the corner here or in the center where the corners meet, that should be exactly 1 inch square. The lengths of the zippers and all the other measurements that I mentioned are going to be off unless this was printed at 100%. Talk a little bit about fabric. I'm using this EcoPack 400 fabric. It's a waterproof fabric. I will link to it below if you want to use the exact same thing, but you can really use any medium weight fabric for this project. So think about something in the 5 to 10 ounce range. And all that really means is that if you were to measure a square yard of whatever fabric you're using, that square yard would weigh in that 5 to 10 ounce range. So this is the fabric that I'm using. Before you cut this out, I want to talk a little bit about zipper and some of the seam allowance things. There might be an adjustment or two that you need to make depending on what zipper you're using. I call for a number 5 nylon coil zipper. I want to make sure that it's a nylon coil zipper. They tend to work well on pouches like this. They tend to work well like when they're sewn into a curve or they've got a little bit of flex to them. They still open and close really well. I would not recommend a metal tooth zipper. We're going to be sewing the ends of our zipper directly into this seam here, and that's a lot harder to do with a metal tooth zipper. So I recommend nylon coil. I recommend a number 5. And as far as zippers go, what the number means, in this case, number 5, that just means that the width of the zipper teeth themselves, that's 5 millimeters across. And then you have the width of the zipper tape. And on a number 5, that should be 1.25 inches wide. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit, but let's talk about these other materials first. I've got a couple of zipper pulls here. You really only need one, but I like to make sure that my pouch can open from both directions. So if you want to use 2, you can. If you only want to use 1, that's fine as well. I have a couple pieces of paracord here. These are going to be attached to your zipper pulls at the very end of the project to make them a little bit easier to grab onto and to kind of cut down on some of the noise that these zipper pulls make. You're going to need about 60 inches of 3/4 inch grosgrain ribbon seam tape. And we're going to finish all of the seams on this pattern with seam tape. And I already have my pieces cut out, but I will tell you how long to cut them at each stage of this video. An optional piece here is a small piece of hook and loop. This is the loop side, and a lot of times I like to put a little patch on my pouches to sort of label what they are, or you can just put something fun on there if you've got a fun patch, but that's going to go right here on the center on one of the sides. That's optional. Also optional, I have a couple pieces of 3/4 inch webbing versus the seam tape ribbon. These are going to be used as zipper pull tabs on the ends here, and I also have this piece here that I'm going to put on one of the ends as a little handle. If you haven't done a lot of sewing, or if your machine can't handle a little bit thicker fabrics, instead of using webbing, you can always use another piece of grosgrain ribbon for your zipper pull tabs and your handle. This is softer, this is thinner, it's easier to sew through, and I've done that on pouches before and it's perfectly acceptable. It's not quite as heavy weight as the webbing, but it will still work. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the width of your zipper and the seam allowance in the pattern. There's sort of a special relationship between how wide your zipper is and the seam allowance in the pattern and the overall shape and size of the finished product. So this is a sample that I made when I was testing out this pattern to make sure everything works together. And overall on this pattern, what we want to have is 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape. Okay, you can see that here on the sample pouch that I made. In the directions, I call for a number 5 zipper that's 1 1/4 inches wide. I also have 3/8 inch seam allowance for the zipper seam. Everywhere else in the pattern, I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but for the zipper, I like to have a little bit wider seam allowance sometimes, especially if you're just starting out. It's nice to have a little bit wider seam allowance when you're sewing the zipper. So the important part here is this. I call for a number 5 zipper. That's 1 1/4 inches wide. I've got 3/8 inch seam allowance for the zipper seam. If you line up your zipper on your pattern piece, just like this, you're gonna clip it or pin it in place, and you're gonna sew 3/8 inch over. And because this is 1 1/4 inches wide, when we finish the seam, you're gonna end up with exactly 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape. And that's what we want. That's what you can see here in this sample. And it's really important to maintain 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape because, as you can see in the sample, this zipper seam here, the zipper gets sewn into this seam. So if you were using a narrower zipper and you didn't make an adjustment, you would have less zipper tape exposed. If you were using a wider zipper and you didn't make an adjustment, you would have more zipper tape exposed. And that's going to widen this seam. It's going to widen this half of the seam. So when you go to sew this seam, it's not going to work. It's going to line up funny. It's going to be hard to sew. And it's also going to change the overall dimensions of this pouch. So on the soft material, it's a little bit hard to see, but this is meant to be basically, these are sewn at an angle, but it's basically kind of a square shape. So if you've got more exposed zipper or less exposed zipper, you're going to change the dimensions of the pouch and it's going to look a little bit off as well. So if you have a number 5 zipper and you have, and it's 1 1/4 inch wide, you don't need to make any adjustments. You're set to go. You can set this zipper right on here. You can pin or clip it in place and you can sew this at 3/8 inch and you'll be good to go. If you're using a narrower zipper, so for example, this zipper tape is only 1 inch wide. Remember, we still want to have 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape. So even if you're using a narrower zipper, we still want to maintain 1/2 inch of exposed zipper tape here. So what you need to do, you have a couple of options. The option that I think I would recommend is to not mess with the pattern, not change the pattern, but you'll simply need to offset your zipper tape to the pattern piece when you sew it. And what that will do is you'll still sew at 3/8 inch here, like the pattern calls for, but you're going to offset your zipper tape 1/8 inch so that when you sew this, you're only sewing into your zipper tape 1/4 inch. And if your zipper tape is 1 inch wide and you sew 1/4 here and you sew 1/4 here, then you're going to be left with exactly 1/2 inch. So again, this would be for a narrower zipper, a 1 inch wide zipper. You would want to offset that zipper tape when you sew this seam. You're going to offset it by about 1/8 inch, actually exactly 1/8 inch. The other option would be to trim 1/8 inch seam allowance off of the top, off of both sides. And then you could line your zipper up flush with the edge of the fabric when you sew it, and then just sew the whole thing at 1/4 of an inch. That's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. Maybe that's easier for you, that's totally fine. The important thing is we're maintaining 1/2 of an inch of exposed zipper tape so that all of the seams line up after the zipper is installed. The opposite would be true if you were using a wider zipper tape. This is an 1.5 inch wide zipper tape. This is some pretty, this is a number 8 zipper. It's a pretty beefy zipper. It's overkill for a pouch like this, but maybe you want to use a number 8, or maybe that's what you have. You would want to compensate for this wider zipper tape so that we're still only having 1/2 of an inch zipper tape exposed. You could do one of two things. You could add an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to both edges of the zipper seam, and then you could sew your entire zipper seam at 1/2 of an inch. Okay, because we already have 3/8 built in, and if you add an 1/8 to that, that's 1/2 of an inch. And then you could sew this really wide zipper at 1/2 of an inch on both sides, and you would end up with you'd end up with 1/2 of an inch of exposed zipper. The alternative would be to trim an 1/8 of an inch off of each long edge of a wider zipper, so that you could then just line it up flush and sew at the original 3/8 inch that I have built into the pattern. I probably wouldn't recommend that. Zipper tape comes with this nice clean edge, and I've never really trimmed a zipper tape, but you can do that if you want to. That's totally your call. But the important thing is, in either case, whether you are using the 1.25 inch wide zipper tape that I call for, or if you've got a wider one like this that's 1.5 inches, or if you've got a 1 inch zipper tape, the important part is we want to maintain exactly 1/2 of an inch of exposed zipper tape in the finished pouch. And that's going to make sure that the dimensions stay correct and that this zipper seam that we sew later is going to line up and work out. If you're not quite sure what I'm talking about here, or you're a little bit confused, feel free to get in touch in the comments, or you can get in touch with me at taylortailor.com, and I'm happy to help you in your specific situation, figuring out which way you need to compensate so that you can make this pouch. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the tools you might need. If you haven't cut your pattern out already, then just a pair of scissors, or you can use a rotary cutter to do that. I like to use this little chalk wheel to make chalk marks. There's a couple places that you might want to do that on this pattern. You could probably get away with a light pencil mark for this pattern as well. I've got a pair of scissors to trim threads at the sewing machine. And speaking of thread, this probably should have been in the materials section, but you just need some basic all-purpose polyester regular weight sewing thread. It pretty much comes in one weight. You don't need anything special like a heavy bonded nylon or anything for this. We're using regular all-purpose polyester thread. I've got a couple rulers. I like to have a couple rulers out just to check my seam allowances and make sure everything is lining up. I love these clips here. These are really nice for clipping like our zipper and our fabric together as we sew. The other thing would be a lighter. There's a few places in the construction here where we're going to want to just lightly melt the ends of some of our materials to keep them from fraying. Okay, so the first step in actual construction here is to sew your zipper seam. The plan in this pattern is to finish all of the seams with grosgrain ribbon seam tape. If you don't have seam tape or you don't want to use it, you can still make this pouch, but you'll need to finish some of your seams with a zigzag stitch or a serger if you have one. That's especially true if you're using a fabric that frays. If you're using like a denim or a canvas or something like a natural fiber that tends to fray, you'll definitely want to finish all of the edges that I'm going to be finishing with seam tape. You want to finish those with a zigzag stitch or a serger. What you're going to want to do is sew a zigzag stitch all the way around these edges here. And you're going to want to do that on both sides. So these two short edges and these long edges, as well as these edges here. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, if you've never done this before, if you're not sure how to sew a zigzag stitch, I have a beginner sewing video that I've linked to below, and I go over how to do this in detail, how to use a zigzag stitch to finish the raw edges of fabric. And that video is linked to below, and it's timestamped, so you can click on just the part that you need, just the part about zigzag stitching. But I would highly recommend that you do that now before we start sewing the zipper seams. If you're using grosgrain ribbon to finish all of your seams, then what you want to go ahead and do now is cut your zipper tape. It's 11 5/8 of an inch long. If that's a weird measurement for you, you could do it at 11 3/4, or you could even cut it to 12 if you want to. go ahead and cut your zipper now, and then what you want to do is separate the two zipper halves. All right, so the first step in sewing our zipper seams is to pin or clip our zipper to our fabric along these long edges. And we want to do this with the right sides together. So the right side of your fabric is facing up and the right side of your zipper is facing down. Your zipper teeth should be facing towards the middle of this pattern piece. And the right side is just the side that's going to be on the outside of your finished pouch. So the right side of the zipper that's going to be on the outside of your finished pouch, and the right side of the fabric that's going to be on the outside of the pouch. We have right sides together as we sew this zipper seam. So at this point, you should have made any adjustments to your seam allowance, depending on how wide your zipper tape is, if you have to offset that at all, or if you have to add or trim away seam allowance. And I'm going to go to the machine and we're going to sew this at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way across on both sides. Again, if you've adjusted your seam allowance here, yours might be a little bit different to accommodate for a wider or narrower zipper. Okay, so we are at the machine. I have my zipper foot on. Some zipper foots you can place to the left or the right of your presser bar. I have my zipper foot to the right because I have my work aligned to the left. Yours might look a little bit different. That's okay. We have our zipper and fabric clipped together, right sides together, and I'm going to go ahead and sew this at 3/8 of an inch all the way down. Make sure that you do a nice back tack at the beginning of all of your stitch lines. So that's going to be a few stitches forwards, a few backwards, and then we're going to sew. And just as a little reminder, make sure your thread tails are kind of out of the way like this so that they don't get tangled up on the bottom when we sew. And we're sewing at a medium stitch length here, so on your machine that's probably somewhere right around a 2.5. Okay, so your project should look like this. At this point, we have both sides of the zipper sewn to both sides of the pouch like this. The next step is to finish this zipper pouch seam with the grosgrain binding tape. So what I like to do is do a little bit of a pre-fold with the binding tape. And this won't be a permanent fold, it's actually gonna still kind of fold open, but putting in a little bit of a pre-crease helps it to stay in place once we clip it to our project. So I just fold the ribbon in half like this, and then I take something hard like at the end of a pair of scissors and I just kind of rub it on that fold. And like I said, it's not going to stay permanently yet, but it really helps keep things in place as we start to sew this binding. So I'm going to do this with both pieces of my binding, and then I'm going to clip the binding to this seam. And you want your binding to be cut at the same length as your zipper. So it's 11 5/8 is the true measurement, but if you want to do 11 3/4 or 12, that's fine. We'll just end up trimming those ends flush with this pattern piece when the time comes. Okay, so I've got the binding clipped to each side of the zipper seam, and I will meet you at the machine to sew it down. Okay, so we're at the machine and I have a regular presser foot installed again, and I have this set up so that I'm going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch over from the edge of this seam tape. So you can line yours up in a similar way. There are two things we want to pay attention to here. We want to make sure that we are catching the underside of the seam tape. So the edge that's folded under, we want to make sure we're sewing through both layers. And the other thing we want to pay attention to is that the seam tape doesn't start to drift away from your pouch. We want to make sure that the fold of the seam tape stays pretty much flush right up against this layer of fabric and this zipper edges right there. Like always, we're going to back tack at the beginning and end of our stitch lines, and I actually changed my thread color to black just so that it matches the seam tape, but that's not necessary at all. That's totally optional. I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch over all the way down to the other end, and I'm going to do that on both sides. Okay, at this point your binding should be installed over both zipper seams. And the next step here, we want to take and fold that seam allowance back to the wrong side of the fabric. And we're just going to kind of finger press this seam open, fold it to the back as best we can. We want to do that on both sides so that bound seam just folds back and kind of folds to the center of the fabric, and then just finger press this open as best you can. And I'm going to meet you at the machine and we're going to do some top stitching. Okay, so we're going to top stitch this zipper seam from the right side of our fabric, and top stitching can be decorative, it can be functional. In this case, it's a little bit of both. It's going to help this seam allowance lay flat, and it's going to help our zipper run a little bit smoother by top stitching this. We're stitching through all of the layers, and we want to make sure that that seam allowance that we folded back in the previous step, we want to make sure that seam allowance is still folded back and facing this way. So we're going to go ahead and top stitch this now, and I'm stitching, you can stitch this anywhere from about 1/8 up to 1/4 of an inch this way. That's totally up to you. I'm going to do it at about 1/8 of an inch over from this fold. And basically when you're top stitching, you want to try and find somewhere on your presser foot that you can line up your work so that you can get a really nice, straight, professional looking top stitch. And I switched my thread color back to gray just so that it matches my exterior fabric here, but that's a personal preference. You can use whatever color you want. Like normal, we back tack at the beginning of each stitch line, and sometimes with top stitching, it can be helpful to increase your stitch length just a little bit. So I've gone from a 2.5 up to a 3 for this. Top stitching tends to look nice when it's a little bit longer stitch length. Okay, so your project should look like this at this point. We have a nice row of top stitching on both sides of that zipper seam, and you can see how nice and flat that lays now. If you have any extra zipper tape or any extra binding hanging off the edge here, at this point we want to go ahead and trim that off. I've just got a few stray threads, but if your binding shifted at all, or if you cut your zipper and binding a little bit long, go ahead and trim this on all 4 of these sides now. And you just want to make sure that your zipper and binding tape, you want to make sure that that seam is flush with this edge of the pattern piece. All right, up next, we've got a couple optional features that we're going to talk about putting on here. Okay, so the first optional feature is a little loop field for adding a patch later if you want to. So you can see here on the pattern, I have this box lined out here, and what I've done is I just punched a hole in each corner of this hook and loop placement markings. And so if you line up your pattern on your piece like so, make sure that everything is aligned. I like to take this chalk wheel and I'm just going to mark each of these holes like so. And then I just like to take a ruler, and this is chalk, so it's going to brush right off. But I like to go ahead and just make those lines a little bit easier to see. And the dimensions of this are 1 3/4 inches by 1 3/4 inches. So I have this little piece of loop. It's one side of a set of Velcro, and I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this right here. And this is going to be on the side panel of the finished pouch. So I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this on here now. We're going to stitch right along each edge of this loop field. Okay, I'm at the machine. I've got my loop field placed right inside that square that I chalked onto my main fabric piece here. And I'm just going to sew around each corner. I'm top stitching about 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And what's going to happen, I'm going to get to the corner here, and with your needle down, you're going to stop sewing, lift up your presser foot, and then just pivot your whole fabric piece. And you're going to do that on each corner. And I'll show you what that looks like right here. Okay, so the next optional feature are zipper pull tabs, and these need to be placed at the center of this seam here. And what I have here are two pieces of 3/4 inch webbing. As I mentioned earlier, you could easily use 3/4 inch grosgrain ribbon here. You could even use 1 inch webbing or 1 inch grosgrain ribbon. The choice really depends on the materials you have and kind of how you think your machine can handle a little bit thicker materials. This is going to be sewn right on, like next to the zipper seam. So the zipper and this are going to overlap each other. And so you're going to have a pretty thick area right in the center here where the zipper tape, the zipper teeth and this webbing all line up together. So most machines should be able to handle that, but if you're worried about it, you can always use you could always use the ribbon instead of the webbing that I'm using here. So basically what we want to do here is we want to make sure that they're centered on this piece here. And I've cut these to 2.5 inches long. So that's going to give us 1 inch to hold on to as we open and close our zipper on each side. So the way we're going to do this is I have on my ruler here, this length here is 4 1/4. So I want to mark the center point, which is 2 1/8. I'm going to do that right here, 2 1/8, and just make sure I can see that. I'm going to do that on both sides. I'm going to mark center point 2 1/8, and we want to basically fold either your webbing or your grosgrain ribbon, fold it in half, and then make sure the loop is facing this way. So the open ends are here, and the open ends are lined up right over that center mark like this. And you'll want to clip that in place, just like this. You're going to do that on both sides. And then what we're going to do is going to go to the machine and we're just going to do a quick basting stitch. A basting stitch is just temporary stitching to hold something in place while we're sewing something else. But we're going to baste this not quite 1/4, just under 1/4 inch, like 1/8 of an inch or so from the edge here, just to hold that in place while we sew some other seams. And I'm just going to baste this in place about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and looks like this. Okay, so the next optional feature that we can do is a little handle, and I've decided to just put this on one side, and I've cut a piece of 3/4 inch webbing to 6 inches long. Again, you could use your grosgrain ribbon here if you want to. I'm going to put it on this side here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a 1/2 inch mark on each side, and it's a 1/2 inch from this corner this way. So 1/2 inch each way, 6 inch piece of webbing or grosgrain ribbon, and I'm going to clip this in place 1/2 inch from each edge. And we're going to do the exact same thing that we did for the zipper pull tabs, and I'm going to baste each end of this in place. And you might make one of these and decide you don't like this, or you might want it longer, or you might want it a different shape. This is just an optional feature, and I'm going to put it on here and try it for a while and see if I like it. Okay, your piece should look like this now if you've chosen to do the optional features. The next step is to finally install the zipper pulls. Okay, to install these zipper pulls, I've got the wrong side facing up here. We want to go ahead and fold our right sides so that they're facing up. And there's a wide end to your zipper pull, and we're going to try and feed these ends of the zipper teeth here through the wide end of your zipper pull, and you want to make sure that the zipper pulls are facing inward so that they meet in the middle. And this is a little bit tricky sometimes. It often takes multiple attempts to get this just right. Sometimes it goes right on, but you often need to, okay, so like that time actually went on pretty smooth. And here's what you want to look for when you do this. You want to make sure that these two ends on each side of the zipper, that these are in line with each other. You don't want to have them skewed one way or the other. Sometimes when you're putting on your zipper pull, a few teeth from one side will kind of shift like this. The zipper pull will go on, but then your piece is skewed like this, and you don't want that. If that happens, take the zipper pull off and keep trying until you can get the zipper pull on so that these are in line with each other, just like this side, just like the one that I just did. If they're skewed at all, it's going to be very difficult. If these get skewed at all, it's going to be very difficult to sew this next seam, and your zipper is going to have like a little opening here. It's not going to lie flat. So take your time with this and try to get both sides on as evenly as possible. I'm going to try this other side right now. That first one actually went on pretty easily, but it usually takes several attempts. And it helps if you can hold down each side and hold it down so that they're even to begin with before trying to put this zipper pull or the zipper slider. Some people call them sliders. Okay, took a few tries, but both sides are on evenly. And if you're using two zipper pulls like I am, you can kind of tell that they're uneven when the zippers meet in the middle and everything is flat. There's no like weird little bulging area in the zipper teeth right here. So make sure you get these edges in line with each other when you put your zipper pulls on. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn the whole pouch wrong sides out. And if you need to open this a little bit to do that, you can. Just make sure that as you turn it, that your zipper pulls don't come off. Okay, so it should look like this now. We should be looking at the back side of your zipper and the wrong side of your fabric. What we want to do, we want to take and put the right sides of this zipper, upper zipper area to the right side of this little bottom tab that's sticking out. And we're going to make sure that the zipper is centered right over our zipper pull tab. And it should be as long as you get these edges here lined up. So we're going to put right sides together, and we're going to do this on both sides. I'm just going to clip this in place. Now here's where you might discover that things don't quite line up on the edges. If you didn't get an exact ½ an inch of exposed zipper tape, these edges up here might be a little bit longer or a little bit narrower. Just center it the best you can at this point. I'm doing this on both sides. This is the side where I have the handle, and I'm gonna make sure that that handle kind of lays flat. Center this, and we're just clipping or pinning right sides together, the upper zipper area to that lower tab. Once this is clipped together and everything is in place, we're gonna go to the machine and we're going to sew this seam. We're gonna sew this at 1/4 inch from this edge. So we're just gonna sew across here at 1/4 inch. Okay, so we're at the machine. We're gonna sew this at 1/4 inch. And I just wanna make one note. When your needle gets to these thicker areas where we have the binding tape and the zipper teeth and that webbing or additional grosgrain underneath here, it's perfectly fine to hand crank your machine. In fact, I kind of encourage it. That way, if your needle starts to bind up or shift a little bit, you don't risk breaking a needle. So I would highly recommend in these really thick areas on this project and other ones to just hand crank your machine, and you'll just save yourself some needles and some frustration. Some people like to give the machine some extra gas, some extra juice over the thick areas, and for me, I just kind of lose control over the machine and the project at that point. So I like to just take it slow and ease the needle over these thick areas by hand cranking it. Okay, so your pouch should be looking like this at the moment. Both of these seams have been sewn at 1/4 inch. And now what we want to do is finish these seams with the binding, just like we finished this zipper seam with the binding. And we're going to do the exact same thing. This is 4 1/4 long. And so I've cut my binding 4 about 3/4 long. You can cut it 4 1/4 up to 5 if you want to, whatever's easiest. It's okay to have a little on each end. We can just trim that right off. Sometimes binding likes to shift a little bit as you're sewing it, so it's okay to have this a little bit longer, but it needs to be at least 4 1/4 to start with. And we're gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna pre-fold this in half, and I'm just going to use the end of this pair of scissors to crease that a little bit. I'm gonna do that for both pieces, and then I'm gonna clip it to the ends, just like we clipped the binding to the zipper seam. Okay, I've got my binding folded and clipped to each side, and we're gonna go to the machine, and just like before, I'm going to sew this binding down at about 1/8 inch over from the edge of the binding this way. And we wanna make sure we're catching both sides, and we wanna make sure that this binding isn't pulling off of the pouch this way And now this area that was thick before is even a little thicker now with this binding on here, so I definitely encourage hand cranking your machine over this area. See you at the machine. Okay, so we should have our binding installed on each of these end seams, and if your binding tape is like mine and hanging over the edge here, just go in and snip that off carefully to make it flush with this edge. And go ahead and do that on all 4 sides. Okay, so for the side seams, what you want to do, go ahead and open up your zipper all the way across here so that this is open. It will give us a little bit more flexibility when we're trying to fold and place these side seams. So the side seam are these here, and these are actually sewn at an angle. It's a straight line of sewing, but the finished pouch, these side seams are slightly angled just to give it a little bit more interesting shape. So basically what we want to do here, there are 2 things to pay attention to. One, we have this seam here that we've just put binding on. We want the seam allowance for that to be facing down towards the bottom of the pouch. So that, I want to make sure that that's facing down on all 4 of these. And then you can kind of see, I'll just kind of do this slowly. So it sort of open like this. Basically, this is how you fold that side seam into place. So I'll do that again. It's open like this, and that side seam just kind of folds right into place, just like this. And you'll know you get it right when the seam allowance is facing down, and the seam allowance is basically at the end, right at the end of that side seam. You also, the other thing to make sure of is that these corners here, you want these corners to be very flat, and there's basically one way that this can lie how it's supposed to. Sometimes as you fold this, you might find that your corners are kind of skewed like this, okay? You don't want that. So you'll know that it's in the right place when this is flat right here and the underlayer is not sticking out at all. Everything is in alignment. So these 2 edges should be in alignment, and this seam allowance should be facing down like this. So I'm going to go ahead and clip this one in place, and I'll do another one here on the other side just so you can see it again. So here's this side. This seam allowance again is facing down. You don't want to have the seam allowance going that way. You want to have it facing down, and you want to get these edges flush with each other, and these corners should be kind of flat, and they shouldn't be skewed at all like this or like bubbling or in any way. They should just be laying flat. So here's what it looks like when it's open. Turn it like this, push that seam allowance down, and then the rest of it just kind of falls into place, flat across here. I'm going to go ahead and clip this one in place. Okay, so at this point before we sew, your project should look something like this. Each of these side seams have been clipped in place, and we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew each of these at 1/4 inch. I'm going to sew these at 1/4 inch on all 4 sides. And it's important that as you're sewing, you want to sew all the way from this edge right here, all the way to this edge. So on this side, you're basically going to be stopping at that seam tape, but it's 1/4 inch over from here, but you want to make sure that you sew actually all the way to this angled edge. All right, let's go ahead and sew up these side seams. Again, this is 1/4 inch from this edge this way. I'm going to go ahead and repeat that on all 4 corners. Okay, all 4 corners of your pouch should be sewn up at this point, and you can tell I even had a little bit of trouble with some of mine getting them to be perfectly at 1/4 inch, so I went back and I re-sewed some of these seams. It's totally fine to do that. In fact, I'd recommend it. It makes for a nicer looking project in in the end to fix any mistakes. So the next step here, we're almost done, is to bind all 4 of these seams. And we're going to do the exact same thing that we've been doing. We're going to fold each piece of binding in half, and I'm going to pre-crease that with a pair of scissors just to get that initial crease in. Then I'm going to clip each one in place like this. These pieces are cut to 2 1/4 inch long. That should cover that whole seam. And the top end of each of our pieces of binding here, this is actually going to be exposed. So I would highly recommend taking a lighter and just lightly hitting the edge of each piece of this binding here with a lighter just to prevent it fraying. If you don't like the idea of using a lighter, that's totally fine. You could cut these a little bit longer, and at the very top, if you wanted to fold over that seam allowance, you could do it like that. You know, the seam allowance could just be folded over, but you would need to cut these longer. The other option would be to fold it inside like this, then fold it like so. That's an option, but I like to keep my corners as without like really heavy layers in my corners. I like to keep them as light as possible. So I'm gonna just singe each end of these with my lighter before I sew them on. And technically, you can see like on mine here, this bit of grosgrain is already fraying a little bit. Technically, that's gonna be covered with our binding, but I'm gonna go ahead and just lightly singe all 4 sections of that as well, just to make sure that no bits of fraying binding come out later when I start using this. And it doesn't take much heat or flame to get these parts to lay flat without fraying. Okay, so I've got this side seam with my binding on it ready to go, and basically we're doing the exact same thing as before. We want to catch both layers of the binding, and we're stitching about 1/8 of an inch over from the edge of the binding here, and we're going to do that on all 4 corners of the pouch. Okay, you should have all 4 of your side seams bound like this, and it is a little bit awkward up here since this is an angled seam. Your binding tape is going to be square where the piece underneath it is angled. That's fine, it's not a big deal at all. So what we want to do now is go ahead and turn the pouch so that the right sides are out. Okay, all of your corners should push out pretty easily since this is at an angle, at least the top angle. And the next step here is to install our paracord on our zipper pull tabs to make for a little bit easier grip when you open and close the zipper. So basically, we put one end of the paracord through the small hole in the bottom. We're going to do the other side of the paracord through the top, so it looks like that. Make sure that the sides are even, and then I just tie a very simple double knot, and I try to get the knot as close as I can to the top of that metal zipper pull. So tie your knot, and then just feed that paracord up a little bit so you can tie the knot closer to the top of your zipper pull, like so. Okay, the last step in construction here, I want to cut off these longer threads, or these longer tails on this paracord. So I cut them off about 1/2 of an inch or so above the knot, and I want to do that on both sides. Then definitely want to use a lighter to melt the ends of these. This paracord stuff frays really quickly. Make sure those are nice and melted. Do that on both sides. Okay, and as far as construction goes, that's about it. As soon as you have these tails clipped and the ends melted, That about does it for the construction. I just need to find a patch for it. And that's the Livingston, ready for travel, everyday carry, or whatever you need it for. I just got back from Las Vegas with mine packed with my glasses, an eye mask, and a few overflow toiletries. It held up perfectly and fit right in the water bottle pocket of my backpack when I needed my hands free. If you make one, I would genuinely love to see it. Tag me on Instagram at taylortailor, the link is in the description. The pattern with full written instructions is at taylortailor.com. That link is also in the description whenever you're ready to sew. If you enjoyed this and you want to see what we build next, subscribe so you don't miss it. We've got a lot more gear to make together. Thanks for watching and sewing with me. See you next time.